Shabbat Shalom. Dr. John Fryer was a man of uncommon brilliance. He entered the second grade at age 5. He graduated from high school at age 15. He graduated from college at age 19 and was one of the youngest students ever to study psychiatry at the University of Vanderbilt Medical School program, graduating in 1962. Dr. John Fryer was also gay. Back then, homophobia was codified and enshrined by the medical community and criminalized by law, a legally sanctioned form of hate. At that time, it was legal to refuse to rent to someone on the basis of their sexual orientation. It was legal to refuse to hire someone or to fire someone on the basis of their gender identity. Back then, you could be arrested simply for walking down the street holding the hand of your beloved. Or you could be arrested for simply ordering a beverage in a gay bar. Dr. John Fryer was taunted and harassed by students on the playground, and even when he got to medical school, he found no reprieve. At the time, the foundational diagnostic text used by all psychiatrists, the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual for Mental Disorders, or DSM, still listed homosexuality as a mental disorder. In other words, as Dr. John Fryer was studying to become a doctor, he was being taught that the way he felt, that who he was attracted to, was a disease. Dr. Fryer wanted more than anything in the world to be seen and loved for who he was. He wanted to live an authentic, vibrant life. And he knew that the only way he could pursue his professional ambitions of becoming and working as a psychiatrist was to hide his heart, to pretend that he was not gay. The few times he shared his sexual orientation painfully proved the impossibility of living out of the closet. For instance, once early in his training, he just started a residency program at the University of Pennsylvania. He went out for dinner with a close family friend. They were sitting at dinner and conversation was flowing, and this was a person he'd known for quite some time, someone with whom he felt a closeness. And it was so hard and so depressing to live every day hiding himself. Over dinner, he started to share what it was like to be him, what it was like to be gay in a world that was so homophobic. After dinner that night, this close family friend called a relative, who apparently then called the head of his residency program. The next morning, he was summoned to the main office and given the choice to either resign or be fired. Dr. Fryer never shared his sexual orientation again, but the damage of being outed had already been done. Because of that call, because of the world he lived in, he couldn't complete his residency at the elite competitive program that he should have been able to complete it at. Instead, he was forced to train at a state-run psychiatric hospital, which meant that when he completed his residency, he struggled He didn't have the same access to employment opportunities, and he struggled even more because he was fired repeatedly, because he was too flamboyant, or because someone would suspect that he was gay, and they would just fire him as a result. So even though he was uncommonly brilliant, and even though everyone who knew him and everyone who saw him in practice said he was a beyond talented practitioner, he never found the professional success he dreamed of. He never found the professional success he deserved. In psychology, there is a concept called learned helplessness. As it's defined in psychology today, learned helplessness occurs when an individual continuously faces a negative, uncontrollable situation and stops trying to change their circumstances, even when they have the ability to do so. I'm going to read that one more time. Learned helplessness occurs when an individual continuously faces a negative, uncontrollable situation and stops trying to change their circumstances, even when they have the ability to do so. This, by the way, is how circuses train elephants. They take little, cute baby elephants, and they tie them up. And they constrain their every movement. And those elephants at the time are small enough that the ropes can hold them. And they test their bounds, and they learn that humans are all powerful and that they have no power against the ties that bind them. They learn helplessness. And that means that as those elephants grow, and we all know elephants grow to become much stronger and much larger than any person. But because they've learned this helplessness as a baby, as they get older, they stop testing their bonds. They stop fighting. They just assume that humans will always outpower them. We're not elephants, obviously. But we too can become habituated to the narrowness of our own circumstances. We too can become accustomed to suboptimal reality. We too can stop trying to find a new way to move, a way to improve. We saw this so clearly in our Torah reading a few weeks ago, Parshat Shlach Lecha. Right? When our ancestors lived in Egypt, they learned some helplessness. Their experience of another people was that other people oppressed them and enslaved them. And so even when God comes in and saves them with miracles and signs and power, right, with an outstretched arm, and God says to them, I'm with you. I'm going to be with you. I'm taking you out of Egypt to show you that I am with you, to show you my power. And you are going to go to the land that I promised your ancestors. You are going to go to the promised land, and I'm going to fill you with strength. And you're going to conquer those peoples, and you're going to conquer the land, and that's going to be the holy land. That's going to be the beacon of this promise. But they can't hear that, because their only association of foreign peoples is that foreign peoples overpower them. They have learned that they are helpless, and nothing God says can change that. And so when they're literally there facing the promised land, they are freaking out, and they decide to send spies over to take a look. And of course, the spies go and they look, and they say, we're like grasshoppers. Everyone there is so big and so scary, we cannot go. And because of that learned helplessness, every person who came out of Egypt died in the desert. Not a single one of them ever made it to the promised land. But that's not the only story our Torah gives us. In today's reading, we read about the daughters of Slavkrad. I want to name them because so often they're just called the Daughters of Slavkrad, but they had names. Machla, Chogla, Milka, Tirza, and Noah. These women grew up in a world where they were second-class citizens, in a world where they could not own property, in a world where they could not determine where they would live, where they would go, in a world where their lives were prescribed by first their father, and if they got married, then their husband. They lived in a world where women could not be witnesses, could not be judges, were not seen as respected elders. Women were objects. And you can guarantee there was no one in their world saying to them, "You've got this, you can be a strong, powerful woman." Not only that, but there were no societies around them with strong, powerful women. It wasn't as though in their society women didn't have power, but look over there, you can see a society where women had power. They had no reason to feel empowered. And yet, somehow, when their father died, leaving them destitute according to the rules as they were, they didn't resign themselves to that destitution. They didn't resign themselves to their fate. They tuned into their inner clarity. They used the courage of their conviction to stand up for themselves. And in a world where women were not heard, they stood up in front of Moses in the presence of the entire people. They shared their story, the pain of their situation, the injustice of their situation. Moses listened. God listened. And because of their brave testimony, the rules were changed. They were able to improve their lives. They were able to inherit. They were able to protect their future. And they were able to change the rules for all the women that came after them. It's so tempting in our world today to look around and feel overwhelmed. On every front, it can feel like nothing I do matters. Everything I've done to try to make a difference hasn't changed the status quo. I'm powerless to make a difference. But the Torah is very clear in giving us these two stories. The Torah wants us to realize that we have two choices. We can give in to our learned helplessness. But where does that get us? Nowhere. If we give in to our learned helplessness, if we give in to the feelings of futility, that's just going to ensure that we die on the wrong side of the Jordan River, that we never make it to the promised land. But the Torah gives us the stories of Machla, Chogla, Noah, Milcah, and Tirzah to remind us that the most powerless people, the people that seem to have the worst odds, are often the ones that can turn the tide. The trick is in shifting our perception. Which brings me back to Dr. John Fryer. In 1970, activists were working to try to pressure the American Psychiatric Association to remove homosexuality from the DSM. They recognized that the doctors in the Psychiatric Association were far more likely to listen to a fellow doctor than to simply an activist. So they started reaching out to gay psychiatrists that they knew. They called Dr. John Fryer. He said, "No way." Let me read you what exactly he said as he told it to the New York Times. He said, "My first reaction was, no way. I had no security, and I did not want to do anything to jeopardize the possibility that I could get a faculty position somewhere. There was no way at that point that I was going to do that as an open thing." In other words, Fryer's first reaction was from this place of learned helplessness. He knew what had happened when he'd shared his identity before. And he wasn't into just destroying his career, because he also had the sense that the world wasn't going to change. He tried and he tried and he tried, but it continued to be cruel and homophobic. And so what was the point? But one of the activists kept calling. Barbara Giddings called Dr. John Fryer over and over and over again, begging him to reconsider. She also called every other gay psychiatrist that she knew. And then after she called every other gay psychiatrist that she knew, she called back Dr. John Fryer and told him about their conversations. And she told him what they had said. And she told him why they had said no. And she told him that just because the world had always been cruel and homophobic did not mean that's how the world had to be. She told him that he had power, the power of his brilliant mind, the power of his lived experience. She told him he could make a difference. Finally, Dr. Fryer agreed, but on one condition. On May 2nd, 1972, Dr. John Fryer was smuggled into the American Psychiatric Association convention through the back door. He wore a garish wig, a mask that had been melted in order to distort his facial features, and a massive, ill-fitting tuxedo. He sat there in front of all of those psychiatrists and spoke eloquently for 10 minutes. He said, "All of us have something to lose. We may not be under consideration for a professorship. The analyst down the street may stop referring us his overflow. Our supervisor may ask us to take a leave of absence. But we are taking an even bigger risk in not living fully our humanity." After his speech, Dr. Fryer, or Dr. Anonymous, as he introduced himself at this convention, once again fled through the back doors. He flew home. He didn't tell a single person about where he had been or what he had done. He just went back to life as normal. But his words had made a difference. The following year, the American Psychiatric Association removed homosexuality from the DSM, thereby removing the legal basis for discrimination in housing, employment, health care, citizenship, the right to have and parent children, the right to serve in the military, and ultimately the right to marry. Dr. Fryer passed away in 2003. But today we are remembering him because we are his living legacy. We're remembering him because he taught us that even in those moments when we feel powerless, we can make a difference. We're not just his descendants, we're the descendants of Machla, Chogla, Noah, Milka, and Tirzah. We are the descendants of powerful women who didn't need other people to tell them they could make a difference, who stood up on their own 2 feet, shared their voices, and were heard. We may feel overwhelmed by our world. We may feel that our efforts are futile, but these ancestors stand up and shout at us that we have power if only we choose to use it. As Dr. Fryer said, all of us have something to lose, but we face an even bigger risk in not living our full humanity. Please rise, page 184.